In the winter of 1513, a messenger rode through the narrow streets of Florence, bearing news that would reshape the destiny of Europe. Giovanni de Medici, second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, had been elected Pope Leo X. He was 37 years old. His family had been bankers, not bishops. They had been exiled from their own city, hunted by enemies, stripped of their fortune. And yet now, one of their own sat upon the throne of St. Peter. Lorenzo the Magnificent had once written to his son that Rome was a sewer of all the world's iniquities. He had trained Giovanni for this moment anyway. The question that echoed through the halls of the Vatican and the counting houses of Florence was not whether the Medici had bought the papacy. It was how long they had been planning to do so, and what they intended to do with it now that they had won. The Medici rise began not with conquest or noble blood, but with double-entry bookkeeping and an appetite for risk that bordered on recklessness. In the early 15th century, Giovanni de Medici transformed his family's modest banking operations into the largest financial network in Europe. He understood something that others had missed. The Catholic Church, despite its spiritual mission, was one of the wealthiest institutions on earth, collecting tithes and taxes from every corner of Christendom. Someone had to move that money, convert those currencies, and manage those accounts. Giovanni positioned his bank as the Vatican's primary financial agent, handling papal revenues across Europe. The profits were staggering. By the 1420s, the Medici Bank operated branches in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London, and Avignon. Each branch sent profits flowing back to Florence, where Giovanni reinvested them in wool manufacturing, silk trading, and political influence. But Giovanni was careful. He lived modestly, avoided ostentatious displays, and counseled his sons to never attract envy. Power, he taught them, should be wielded quietly, from behind the curtain of civic duty and religious patronage. His son Cosimo would take that lesson and transform Florence into the Medici family's private workshop. Cosimo de' Medici never held a formal title higher than banker. He was never duke, never prince, never declared ruler of Florence. Yet from 1434 until his death in 1464, he controlled the Republic as surely as any monarch controlled a kingdom. He manipulated elections, placed allies in key positions, and used his vast wealth to bind the city's elite to his interests through loans they could never refuse and debts they could never repay. When rivals accused him of tyranny, he responded with libraries, hospitals, and churches. He commissioned Fra Angelico to paint the walls of San Marco, creating frescoes of such serene beauty that they seemed to sanctify the Medici name by association. He rebuilt the Church of San Lorenzo and turned it into the family's private chapel. He collected ancient manuscripts from across the known world and made them available to scholars, establishing Florence as the center of humanist learning. He funded Donatello, whose bronze David became the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity. A symbol of republican virtue that simultaneously celebrated Medici patronage, Florence became the intellectual center of Europe under his watch, not because Cosimo loved learning for its own sake, but because he understood that culture was a form of political power. A city dazzled by beauty would not question who held the strings. When Cosimo died, the Florentine government granted him a title no private citizen had received since ancient Rome. They called him Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. But it was Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo, who perfected the family's strategy and brought it to the very gates of the Vatican. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, assumed control of Florence in 1469 at the age of 20. He inherited not just wealth and influence, but a precarious position. The Medici Bank was in decline. Branches across Europe were failing, debtors were defaulting, and rivals sensed weakness. Lorenzo responded not by retreating, but by doubling down on political power. He cultivated relationships with every major court in Italy, playing Milan against Venice, Naples against Rome, maintaining a delicate balance that kept Florence safe and himself indispensable. But in 1478, members of the rival Pazzi family, with the backing of Pope Sixtus IV, attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass in the Florence Cathedral. Giuliano died on the marble floor, stabbed 19 times. Lorenzo survived with a wound to the neck. The conspirators expected the city to rise against the Medici. Instead, Florence erupted in rage. The Pazzi conspirators were hunted through the streets and hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. The Archbishop of Pisa, who had supported the plot, was hanged in his vestments. Bodies swung from the fortress walls for days. Lorenzo emerged from the attempted coup stronger than before, but he had learned a bitter lesson. The papacy itself was an enemy, as long as it remained outside Medici control. Lorenzo understood that his family's survival depended on more than money or military alliances. It required controlling the flow of ideas, art, and talent. He gathered around him the greatest minds of the age. Marsilio Ficino translated Plato's complete works from Greek to Latin under Lorenzo's patronage and founded the Platonic Academy in Florence. Pico della Mirandola wrote his famous oration on the dignity of man while living under Lorenzo's protection, arguing that human beings possessed the freedom to shape their own destiny. A young Michelangelo Buonarroti lived in the Medici household as a teenager, studying classical sculpture in the family's garden and dining at Lorenzo's table. Leonardo da Vinci returned to Florence and worked under Medici influence. Botticelli painted allegories that blended Christian themes with pagan mythology, creating a visual language that would define the Renaissance. The Birth of Venus and Primavera depicted ancient gods with the faces of contemporary Florentines, suggesting that classical virtue had been reborn in Medici Florence. Lorenzo was not simply a patron. He was orchestrating a cultural revolution that positioned Florence as the new Rome, and the Medici as the new Caesars. But Lorenzo wanted more than cultural dominance. He wanted the church itself. The strategy Lorenzo devised was patient and dynastic. He could not simply buy the papacy outright. Such corruption, while common, had to be masked beneath layers of propriety. Instead, he invested in his children. His daughter Maddalena was married to Franceschetto Cibo, the illegitimate son of Pope Innocent VIII, cementing an alliance with the Vatican. But Lorenzo's greatest gamble was his second son, Giovanni. Lorenzo secured Giovanni's appointment as a cardinal when the boy was only 13 years old. It was an extraordinary breach of church law, which required cardinals to be at least 30. The appointment was possible only because of the enormous debts Pope Innocent owed to the Medici Bank. Giovanni received the red hat in secret, and the appointment was not announced publicly until he turned 16. Lorenzo wrote to his son with precise instructions. Giovanni was to be humble, pious, and cautious. He was to avoid scandal, cultivate allies, and remember that Rome was a nest of vipers. Lorenzo knew he would not live to see his son become pope, but he laid the foundation carefully. When Lorenzo died in 1492 at the age of 43, Florence mourned, but the plan he had set in motion continued to unfold. The path from cardinal to pope was neither quick nor certain. Giovanni de Medici spent 20 years navigating the treacherous politics of the Vatican. He survived the reign of the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, whose papacy was marked by murder, incest allegations, and naked ambition. He watched as Pope Julius II waged wars across Italy, donning armor and personally leading troops into battle. Giovanni learned when to speak and when to remain silent. He made no enemies and collected favors. He lent money to fellow cardinals, hosted dinners, mediated disputes. He lived modestly by Roman standards, avoiding the excesses that destroyed other cardinals. When Julius died in 1513, the College of Cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel to elect his successor. The conclave was deadlocked. Rival factions could not agree on a candidate. After several days of deliberation, exhausted and divided, the cardinals turned to Giovanni as a compromise. He was young, genial, and seemingly unthreatening. The Medici fortune, carefully deployed through intermediaries, ensured that key votes swung in his direction. On March 11, 1513, white smoke rose from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel. Giovanni de Medici was now Pope Leo X. Leo's papacy was a study in contradictions. He was a man of genuine learning and sophisticated taste, who loved music, poetry, and elaborate ceremonies. He expanded the Vatican library, commissioned Raphael to paint the papal apartments, and supported scholars and artists throughout Rome. Yet he was also profoundly worldly, indulgent, and politically calculating. Within months of his election, he appointed his cousin Giulio de Medici as a cardinal, ensuring the family's grip on the church would extend beyond his own lifetime. He restored Medici control over Florence, installing family members as rulers. He spent extravagantly on banquets, hunts, theatrical performances, and building projects. The papal treasury, already strained by Julius's wars, was emptied by Leo's lavish spending. When funds ran low, Leo authorized the sale of indulgences on an unprecedented scale, offering salvation for cash to fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. The practice was not new, but under Leo it became systematic and aggressive. Priests across Europe sold certificates promising reduced time in purgatory in exchange for donations. The slogan attributed to the German preacher Johann Tetzel captured the cynicism of the enterprise. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. It was this sale of indulgences that ignited the spark Martin Luther had been preparing to light. On October 31st, 1517, Luther, an Augustinian monk and professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, nailed his 95 theses to the door of the castle church. The document was a direct challenge to the church's authority and a condemnation of the sale of indulgences. Luther argued that salvation could not be purchased, that forgiveness came through faith alone, and that the Pope had no power over purgatory. His arguments spread rapidly, printed and reprinted across Europe thanks to the recent invention of the printing press. Pope Leo, when informed of the controversy, dismissed it as a quarrel among monks. He reportedly said that Luther was a drunken German who would feel differently when sober. He underestimated the depth of discontent that had been building for decades. The Church's corruption, its political entanglements, and its financial exploitation of the faithful had eroded trust. Luther's ideas found fertile ground. What began as a theological dispute escalated into a full-scale rebellion against papal authority. Within years, entire regions of Germany, Switzerland, and Scandinavia broke with Rome. The Protestant Reformation shattered the unity of Western Christianity. The irony was brutal and inescapable. The Medici Pope, who represented the pinnacle of Renaissance culture and artistic achievement, had helped trigger the greatest crisis the Catholic Church had ever faced. Leo died in 1521 at the age of 45, reportedly from pneumonia contracted after a hunting trip. Some whispered of poison, though no evidence ever emerged. He left behind a church in turmoil and a papacy bankrupt in both finances and moral authority. Yet his cousin Giulio succeeded him in 1523 as Pope Clement VII, extending Medici control for another decade. Clement's reign saw the sack of Rome in 1527, when mutinous imperial troops stormed the city, killing thousands and desecrating churches. Clement himself was besieged in the Castel Sant'Angelo, a prisoner in his own capital. The violence was widely interpreted as divine judgment against a corrupt church. The Medici had won the papacy, but they had lost the moral high ground that had once given the institution its power. The question that haunts the Medici legacy is whether they created the Renaissance or merely bought it. The art, the philosophy, the architecture, were these achievements genuine expressions of human potential, or were they tools of political manipulation, beauty deployed to mask corruption? The answer is neither simple nor singular. The Medici understood that power in the Renaissance world required more than armies or wealth. It required shaping the very consciousness of an age. They commissioned works that would outlast empires. Michelangelo's David became the symbol of Florentine liberty, even as the Medici strangled that liberty. Botticelli's Birth of Venus celebrated pagan beauty in a Christian world. Brunelleschi's dome over the Florence Cathedral rose higher than any structure built since antiquity. These were not accidents. They were investments. The Medici funded the translation of ancient texts that redefined European thought. Plato and Aristotle, Homer and Virgil were made accessible in Latin and eventually in vernacular languages. Ideas that had been lost for centuries flooded back into European consciousness. The notion that human reason could comprehend the natural world, that individuals possessed inherent dignity, that earthly life was worth celebrating. These ideas reshaped Western civilization. Yet the Medici also embodied the contradictions of their age. They championed humanist learning while crushing political dissent. They funded churches while manipulating the papacy. They celebrated classical virtue while practicing Renaissance vice. Lorenzo the Magnificent wrote sonnets about love and mortality, yet he ordered the execution of enemies without trials. Pope Leo X commissioned Raphael's sublime frescoes while selling salvation to German peasants. The family's greatest achievement was making these contradictions seem not only acceptable, but admirable. They convinced their contemporaries, and much of posterity, that beauty justified power, that patronage excused tyranny, that art redeemed corruption. The Medici bought the papacy, but they also built the intellectual scaffolding of the modern world. They were bankers and tyrants, patrons and schemers, visionaries and opportunists. They understood that history is not written by the righteous, but by those who control the narrative long after their deaths. When we walk through Florence today, when we stand beneath the Sistine Chapel ceiling, when we study the philosophy that emerged from Renaissance humanism, We are walking through the Medici's monument to themselves. They succeeded in a way few dynasties ever have. They made their corruption beautiful. They transformed financial power into cultural immortality. They proved that those who shape how a civilization sees itself can never truly be defeated, because they live on in every painting admired, every building studied, every idea traced back to the moment when their money made it possible.